Lady into Fox by David Garnett. Part 2. Narrated by Najeeb. So that with his gazing on her and knowing her well, even in such a shape, yet asking himself at every moment,
"Can it be she? Am I not dreaming?"
and her beseeching and lastly fawning on him and seeming to tell that it was she indeed, they came at last together and he took her in his arms. She lay very close to him, nestling under his coat and fell to licking his face, but never taking her eyes from his. The husband all this while kept turning the thing in his head and gazing on her, but he could make no sense of what had happened, but only comforted himself with the hope that this was but a momentary change, and that presently she would turn back again into the wife that was one flesh with him. One fancy that came to him because he was so much more like a lover than a husband was that it was his fault, and this because if anything dreadful happened he could never blame her but himself for it. So they passed a good while, till at last a tear welled up in the poor fox's eye, and she began weeping, but quite in silence, and she trembled too as if she were in fever. At this he could not contain his own tears, but sat down on the ground and sobbed for a great while, but between his sobs kissing her quite as if she had been a woman, and not caring in his grief that he was kissing a fox on the muzzle. They sat thus till it was getting near dusk, when he recollected himself, and the next thing was that he must somehow hide her, and then bring her home. He waited till it was quite dark, that he might the better bring her into her own house without being seen, and buttoned her inside his top-coat. Nay, even in his passion tearing open his waistcoat and his shirt, she might lie the closer to his heart. For when we are overcome with the greatest sorrow, we can act not like men or women, but like children whose comfort in all their troubles is to press themselves against their mother's breast, or if she be not there to hold each other tight in one another's arm. When it was dark, he brought her in with infinite precautions, yet not without the dogs scenting her, after which nothing could moderate their clamour. Having got her into the house, the next thing he thought of was to hide her from the servants. He carried her to the bedroom in his arms, and then went downstairs again. Mr. Tubrick had 3 servants living in the house: the cook, the parlour maid, and an old woman who had been his wife's nurse. Besides these women, there was a groom or a gardener, whichever you choose to call him, who was a single man and so lived out, lodging with a labouring family about half a mile away. Mr. Tubrick, going downstairs, pitched upon the parlour maid. "Janet," says he,
"Mrs. Tubrick and I have had some bad news, and Mrs. Tubrick was called away instantly to London and left this afternoon, and I am staying tonight to put our affairs in order. We are shutting up the house, and I must give you and Mrs. Brant a month's wage and ask you to leave tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock. We shall probably go away to the continent, and I do not know when we shall come back. Please tell the others, and now get me my tea and bring it into my study on a tray."
Janet said nothing, for she was a shy girl, particularly before gentlemen. But when she entered the kitchen, Mr. Tubrick heard a sudden burst of conversation with many exclamations from the cook. When she came back with his tea, Mr. Tubrick said,
"I shall not require you upstairs. Pack your own things and tell James to have the wagonette ready for you by 7 o'clock tomorrow morning to take you to the station. I am busy now, but I will see you again before you go."
When she had gone, Mr. Tubrick took the tray upstairs. For the first moment he thought the room was empty, and his vixen got away, for he could see no sign of her anywhere. But after a moment he saw something stirring in a corner of the room, and then behold, she came forth, dragging her dressing gown, into which she had somehow struggled. This must surely have been a comely sight, but poor Mr. Tubrick was altogether too distressed then, or at any time afterwards, to divert himself at such ludicrous scenes. He only called to her softly,
"Sylvia, oh Sylvia, what do you do there?"
and then in a moment saw for himself what she would be at, and began once more to blame himself heartily, because he had not guessed that his wife would not like to go naked, notwithstanding the shape she was in. Nothing would satisfy him then till he had clothed her suitably. bringing her dresses from the wardrobe for her to choose. But as might have been expected, they were too big for her now. But at last he picked out a little dressing jacket that she was fond of wearing, sometimes in the mornings. It was made of a flowered silk, trimmed with lace, and the sleeves short enough to sit very well on her now. While he tied the ribbons, his poor lady thanked him with gentle looks and not without some modesty and confusion. He propped her up in an armchair with some cushions, and they took tea together, she very delicately drinking from a saucer and taking bread and butter from his hand. All this showed him, or so he thought, that his wife was still herself. There was so little wildness in her demeanour, and so much delicacy and decency, especially in her not wishing to run naked, that he was very much comforted, and began to fancy they could be happy enough if they could escape the world and live always alone. From this too sanguine dream he was aroused by hearing the gardener speaking to the dogs, trying to quiet them forever. Since he had come in with his vixen they had been whining, barking and growling, and all as he knew because there was a fox within doors, and they would kill it. He started up now, calling to the gardener that he would come down to the dogs himself to quiet them, and bade the man go indoors again and leave it to him. All this he said in a dry, compelling kind of voice, which made the fellow do as he was bid, though it was against his will, for he was curious. Mr. Tebrick went downstairs, and taking his gun from the rack, loaded it, and went out into the yard. Now there were two dogs. One, a handsome Irish setter that was his wife's dog. She had brought it with her from Tangley Hall on her marriage. The other was an old fox terrier called Nellie, that he had had 10 years or more. When he came out into the yard, both dogs saluted him by barking and whining twice as much as they did before, the setter jumping up and down at the end of his chain in a frenzy, and Nellie shivering, wagging her tail, and looking first at her master and then at the house door, where she could smell the fox right enough. There was a bright moon, so that Mr. Tebrick could see the dogs as clearly as could be. First he shot his wife's setter dead, and then looked about him for Nellie to give her the other barrel. But he could see her nowhere. The bitch was clean gone, till looking to see how she had broken her chain, he found her lying hid in the back of her kennel. But that trick did not save her, for Mr. Tebrick, after trying to pull her out by her chain and finding it useless, she would not come, thrust the muzzle of his gun into the kennel, pressed it into her body, and so shot her. Afterwards, striking a match, he looked in at her to make certain she was dead. Then, leaving the dog as they were, chained up, Mr. Tebrick went indoors again and found the gardener, who had not yet gone home, gave him a month's wage in lieu of notice, and told him he had a job for him yet, to bury the two dogs, and that he should do it that same night. But by all this going on with so much strangeness and authority on his part, as it seemed to them, the servants were much troubled. Hearing the shots while he was out in the yard, his wife's old nurse or nanny ran up to the bedroom, though she had no business there, and so opening the door saw the poor fox dressed in my lady's little jacket, lying back in the cushions, and in such a reverie of woe that she heard nothing. Old nanny, though she was not expecting to find her mistress there, having been told that she was gone that afternoon to London, knew her instantly, and cried out, "Oh, my poor precious! Oh, poor Miss Sylvia! What a dreadful change is this!" Then, seeing her mistress start and look at her, she cried out, "But never fear, my darling, it will all come right. Your old nanny knows you. It will all come right in the end." But though she said this, she did not care to look again, and kept her eyes turned away so as not to meet the fox's lit ones of her mistress, for that was too much for her. So she hurried out soon, fearing to be found by Mr. Tebrick, and who knows, perhaps shot, like the dogs for knowing the secret. Mr. Tebrick had all this time gone about paying off his servants and shooting his dogs as if he were in a dream. Now he fortified himself with 2 or 3 glasses of strong whisky and went to bed, taking his vixen into his arm where he slept soundly. Whether she did or not, is more than I or anybody else can say. In the morning, when he woke up, they had the place to themselves, for on his instructions, the servants had all left first thing, Janet and the cook to Oxford, where they would try and find new places, and Nanny going back to the cottage near Tangley, where her son lived, who was a pigman there.